The sound of piano keys echoed through the basement of the Carter house on a typical Tuesday afternoon. 14-year-old Sophie sat on the wooden bench, her fingers moving slowly across the keys as she tried to get through a simple Mozart piece. She'd been taking lessons for 6 months now, and while her teacher said she was making good progress, things at home were different. Upstairs in his home office, Robert Carter rubbed his temples and let out an annoyed sigh. The muffled sounds of the piano drifted through the floorboards, interrupting his conference call for the 3rd time that hour. He was a corporate lawyer at one of Chicago's biggest firms, and patience wasn't something he had much of these days. "Sorry about that noise," Robert said to his clients on the video call, forcing a smile. "My daughter's going through her piano phase. You know how kids are." The clients laughed politely, but Robert's jaw tightened as another wrong note echoed from below. As soon as the call ended, he walked to the basement door and shouted down the stairs, "Sophie, can you keep it down? Some of us are trying to work up here." The piano stopped immediately. There was silence for a moment, then the soft sound of the basement door closing. Robert went back to his desk, shaking his head. He didn't understand why his daughter was wasting so much time on this. When he was her age, he'd played guitar in a band and dreamed of making it big. But he'd been smart enough to realize it was just a hobby, nothing serious. He'd put away childish dreams and focused on law school, on building a real career. That evening at dinner, Robert's brother and his wife came over. The conversation was light and comfortable until Robert's wife, Linda, mentioned that Sophie had a piano lesson the next day. "Oh, still doing the piano thing?" Robert's brother asked with a grin. "Unfortunately, yes," Robert said, cutting into his steak. "She's down there plinking and plunking away every afternoon." "Drives me crazy," Robert, Linda said quietly, a warning in her voice. But Robert continued, warming to his subject. "I'm telling you, she's just going through a phase. Next month, it'll be something else. Remember when she wanted to learn French? That lasted, 3 weeks? Sophie, sitting across the table, stared down at her plate. Her younger brother Tommy glanced at her, noticing the way her hands had stopped moving, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. "I think it's nice she's exploring her interests." Linda tried again, reaching over to touch Sophie's hand. Robert laughed. "Exploring is fine, but the noise is unbearable. And it's not like she's any good at it. I mean, I played guitar in college, so I know what real musical talent sounds like." Sophie excused herself from the table, mumbling something about homework. Nobody stopped her. As she walked up the stairs to her room, she could still hear her father's voice, making jokes about her concert career to his brother. The next afternoon, Sophie arrived at her piano lesson 15 minutes early. Mrs. Chen, her teacher, was a petite woman in her 60s who'd immigrated from Taiwan 30 years ago. She'd been teaching piano for most of her life, and she had a way of seeing things in her students that others missed. "You're early today," Mrs. Chen said with a warm smile as Sophie set her music books on the piano. "That's good. Eager students learn faster." Sophie managed a small smile but didn't say anything. As the lesson progressed, Mrs. Chen noticed something different. The girl was playing technically well, hitting all the right notes, but there was a heaviness to it. The joy that had been there in previous weeks seemed dimmed. "Sophie," Mrs. Chen said gently, stopping her midway through a piece. "Is everything okay? You seem distracted today." Sophie's hands dropped to her lap. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then in a rush, everything came out. "My dad thinks I'm terrible. He makes fun of me all the time. He tells his friends I'm just going through a phase, and he acts like practicing is this huge inconvenience for him. I don't think he's ever actually listened to me play. Not really, he just hears noise." Mrs. Chen was quiet for a moment, studying her young student. She'd seen this before too many times. Talented children crushed under the weight of a parent's dismissal. "Can I tell you something?" Mrs. Chen asked, pulling up a chair next to the piano bench. "When I was young, my father didn't want me to play piano either. He said it was a waste of time, that I should focus on becoming a doctor or an engineer. Something practical, something that made money." Sophie looked up, surprised. "But my teacher, she saw something in me. She told me I had a gift, and she convinced me not to give up. So I practiced in secret, early in the morning before my father woke up. And you know what? Years later, I played at my first real concert. My father was in the audience. He cried. He told me he'd been wrong, that he was sorry. But what if my dad never thinks I'm good enough?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Chen reached over and gently lifted Sophie's hands, placing them back on the keys. You know what I hear when you play? I hear someone special. You have perfect pitch, did you know that? That's rare, very rare. And the way you feel the music, the way you connect with it, that's not something that can be taught. That's a gift. Sophie felt tears prickling at her eyes. Nobody had ever talked about her playing like this before. There's a regional youth piano competition coming up in 3 months. Mrs. Chen continued. I want you to enter it. I think you could win. My dad would never let me, Sophie said immediately. Then don't tell him. Mrs. Chen said simply, not yet. Let's prepare in secret. Come to extra practice sessions after your regular lessons. We'll work on something spectacular, something that will make everyone listen. And then, when you're ready, when you know you can show them what you're really capable of, that's when we'll tell them. Sophie looked at the piano keys, then back at her teacher. Something stirred inside her, something that felt like hope mixed with determination. What would I play? She asked. Mrs. Chen smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. It's challenging even for professionals. But I think you can do it. I think you can do something extraordinary with it. That's only 3 months away, Sophie said, feeling both excited and terrified. Then we'd better get started, Mrs. Chen said. That evening, Sophie sat at the basement piano with a new sense of purpose. When her father yelled down for her to keep the noise down, she didn't stop playing like she usually did. Instead, she played softer, more carefully, her mind already working through the complex piece Mrs. Chen had introduced her to that afternoon. Upstairs, Robert sat at his desk, barely noticing when the piano sounds became quieter. He was already thinking about his next case, his next meeting, his next deadline. The idea that something remarkable was happening in his basement, that his daughter was beginning a journey that would change everything, never crossed his mind, not yet. The next 2 weeks fell into a careful pattern. Sophie would attend her regular Wednesday lesson, and then 3 times a week, she'd stay for an extra hour to work on the Rachmaninoff piece with Mrs. Chen. The music was unlike anything Sophie had ever attempted before. It was powerful, emotional, and incredibly difficult. Tell your parents you've joined a study group, Mrs. Chen had suggested. It's not entirely a lie. You are studying, just studying music instead of math. Sophie felt guilty about the deception at first, but the lie came easier than she expected. At dinner that first week, when her mother asked why she was getting home later on Mondays. Wednesdays and Fridays, Sophie simply said she'd joined an after-school study group for her history class. That's wonderful. Honey, Linda said, genuinely pleased. I'm glad you're taking your studies seriously. Robert barely looked up from his phone. Just make sure it doesn't interfere with your grades, he muttered. Tommy, her 12-year-old brother, caught her eye across the table. He knew something was up. Tommy always knew. But he didn't say anything, and Sophie was grateful for that. The real breakthrough came 3 weeks into their secret practice sessions. Sophie had been struggling with a particularly complex section of the concerto, her fingers stumbling over the rapid runs of notes. She'd played it wrong for the 10th time, and frustration was building in her chest. I can't do this, she said, pulling her hands back from the keys. It's too hard. Maybe my dad's right. Maybe I'm just not good enough. Mrs. Chen stood up from her chair and walked over to the window. For a long moment, she just looked outside at the autumn leaves falling from the trees. You know why I became a piano teacher instead of a concert pianist? Mrs. Chen asked quietly. Sophie shook her head. Because I believed the people who told me I wasn't good enough. My father, my uncle, even some of my teachers. They said I was good but not great. They said I should teach instead of perform. So I did. She turned back to face Sophie. And I've spent 40 years wondering what might have happened if I'd just believed in myself instead of believing them. The weight of those words settled over Sophie like a blanket. You have something special, Mrs. Chen continued, walking back to the piano. I hear it every time you play, but talent isn't enough. You need to believe in it too. You need to want it so badly that nothing your father says, nothing anyone says can take it away from you. Sophie looked down at the keys, then placed her hands back in position. Can we try it again? Mrs. Chen smiled. One more time. But this time don't think about the notes. Think about how the music makes you feel. Think about everything you want to say to your father but can't. Put that into the piano. Sophie closed her eyes, took a breath, and began again. This time something shifted. The notes weren't just notes anymore. They were anger and hurt and hope all mixed together. They were every dismissive comment her father had made, every eye roll every time he'd made her feel small, and they were also her determination to prove him wrong. When she finished the section, it was perfect. Mrs. Chen's eyes were glistening. "There," she whispered. "That's it. That's what I've been waiting to hear." At home, things continued as they always had. Robert was busy with a major case at his firm, often working late into the evening. When he was home, he'd complain about the piano noise from the basement, usually shouting down for Sophie to give it a rest already. One evening, about 5 weeks into her secret training, Sophie was practicing in the basement when she heard footsteps on the stairs. She tensed, expecting her father, but it was Tommy who appeared at the bottom of the staircase. "That's really good," he said, leaning against the wall. "Thanks," Sophie replied, surprised. "You're getting better." "Like way better." Tommy walked closer, studying her face. "You're not really in a study group, are you?" Sophie's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "Come on, Sophie. I'm not stupid. You've been practicing different stuff lately, harder stuff, and you've been staying after your lessons." He sat down on an old storage box near the piano. "What's going on?" Sophie hesitated, then decided to trust him. Tommy could be annoying sometimes, but he'd never ratted her out before. She told him everything about the competition, about Mrs. Chen's encouragement, about the Rachmaninoff piece she was learning. "That's so cool," Tommy said when she finished. "You're going to blow everyone away." "I don't know about that. I do. You're amazing, Sophie. Dad's just being Dad, you know how he is." Tommy stood up, shoving his hands in his pockets. "I won't tell anyone, promise. Really. Really. But you have to let me come to the competition. I want to see the look on Dad's face when he realizes how wrong he's been." Sophie felt a rush of affection for her little brother. "Deal." As the weeks went by, Sophie's playing transformed. Mrs. Chen had been right about her having perfect pitch, but it was more than that. Sophie had an emotional connection to music that went beyond technical skill. When she played, she wasn't just reading notes on a page. She was telling a story, expressing feelings she couldn't put into words. The piece became part of her. She'd practice the fingering patterns while sitting in her math class. She'd hear the melodies in her head while eating breakfast. At night, she'd lie in bed and mentally play through the entire concerto, her fingers twitching slightly against her blanket. But the constant practice came at a cost. At home, her father's comments became sharper, more cutting. One Saturday morning, Robert was trying to sleep in after a long week at work. Sophie, forgetting what day it was, sat down at the piano at 8 in the morning. She'd barely played 2 measures when her father's voice thundered from upstairs. "Sophie, for crying out loud, it's Saturday. Some people don't want to wake up to that racket." Sophie stopped immediately, her cheeks burning with embarrassment and anger. She heard footsteps above her, heavy and irritated. A moment later, her father appeared at the top of the basement stairs in his bathrobe, his hair messy from sleep. "You know what your problem is?" Robert said, his voice sharp. "You don't think about anyone but yourself. This piano thing, it's selfish. Nobody wants to listen to you stumble through these pieces over and over again." "Robert, that's enough." Linda's voice came from behind him, but Robert was on a roll. "I'm serious. You need to focus on practical skills. Math, science, debate team, things that will actually help you get into a good college. This piano thing? It's a waste of time. Trust me, I know. I went through the same phase with my guitar, and I grew out of it. You will too." Sophie felt hot tears building behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of him. "I'm trying to practice," she said quietly. "Practice for what? You're not going to be a concert pianist. That's a fantasy. Time to grow up and face reality." He turned and walked away, leaving Sophie alone in the basement with her piano. For a long moment, she just sat there staring at the keys through blurry eyes. Then she thought about Mrs. Chen's words. She thought about the competition that was now just 4 weeks away. And she thought about how it would feel to prove her father wrong. Sophie wiped her eyes, placed her hands back on the keys, and started playing again. Softer this time, so her father couldn't complain, but she played. And with every note, her determination grew stronger. Upstairs, Robert climbed back into bed, already dismissing the interaction from his mind. He had no idea that in 4 weeks everything would change. He had no idea that his daughter wasn't just practicing anymore. She was preparing for something that would shake his understanding of who she was and what she was capable of. The competition was coming, and Sophie was ready to show the world what her father refused to see. The morning of the competition arrived with clear skies and crisp autumn air. Sophie woke up at 6, her stomach twisting with nerves. She'd barely slept, running through the piece in her mind over and over, hoping she wouldn't forget anything when it mattered most. She got dressed carefully, choosing the navy blue dress her mother had bought her for special occasions. Her hands were shaking slightly as she buttoned it up. This was it. After 3 months of secret practice, after countless hours of pouring everything she had into this piece, today was the day she'd either prove herself or confirm her father's worst opinions. Downstairs, Linda was already in the kitchen making breakfast. She smiled when Sophie came down, but there was something nervous in her expression too. "Morning, sweetheart. How are you feeling?" Terrified, Sophie admitted, sliding into a chair at the kitchen table. Linda set a plate of toast in front of her. "You're going to be wonderful. Mrs. Chen says you've been working so hard on this. Is Dad coming?" Sophie asked, even though she was afraid of the answer. Linda paused, her back to Sophie as she poured orange juice. "I told him about the competition this morning. I know you wanted to keep it quiet, but I thought he should be there. He's your father, Sophie. Despite everything, I think he needs to see this." Sophie's appetite vanished. "What did he say?" "He wasn't thrilled about being surprised with it, but he agreed to come." Linda turned around and Sophie could see the determination in her mother's eyes. "I made it very clear that this was important, that he needed to show up and support you." Tommy bounded into the kitchen, already dressed and looking excited. "This is going to be so cool. I can't wait to see everyone's faces when you play." At least someone in the family had faith in her. An hour later, they were all in the car heading to the Performing Arts Center downtown. Robert sat in the driver's seat, his jaw tight, checking his phone at every red light. He'd barely said 2 words since they left the house. "How long is this going to take?" he asked as they pulled into the parking lot. "I have work to catch up on this afternoon." "Robert," Linda said sharply, "it'll take as long as it takes. This is your daughter's competition." Robert sighed but didn't argue. They walked into the concert hall together, Robert trailing slightly behind as if he wanted to make it clear he was there under protest. The hall was beautiful, with high ceilings and rows of plush red seats. Other families were already there, parents fussing over their children, adjusting ties and smoothing down hair. Sophie felt completely out of place. Most of these kids had probably been playing piano since they were 5 or 6. Many of them looked confident, comfortable, like they belonged on a stage. Mrs. Chen found them in the lobby. She looked elegant in a burgundy dress, her silver hair pulled back neatly. When she saw Sophie, her whole face lit up. "There's my star pupil," she said warmly, taking both of Sophie's hands in hers. "How are you feeling?" "Like I might throw up," Sophie whispered. Mrs. Chen laughed softly. "That's normal. Every great performer feels nervous before they play. It means you care." She glanced over at Robert, who was checking his phone again, and something flickered in her expression. But she turned back to Sophie with a smile. "Remember everything we practiced. Don't think about the audience. Don't think about anything except the music and what it means to you." They found their seats about 10 rows back from the stage. Robert sat on the aisle as if positioning himself for a quick escape. Linda sat next to him, then Tommy, leaving the seat next to Tommy empty for when Sophie joined them after checking in backstage. The competition began with younger children, 8- and 9-year-olds playing simple classical pieces. They were good, technically proficient, but there was a sameness to their performances. Nervous smiles, careful playing, parents beaming with pride regardless of how it went. Robert checked his watch multiple times. When a particularly young child played a slow, delicate piece, he shifted in his seat and muttered something under his breath about this being longer than he'd expected. Linda elbowed him hard. "Pay attention," she hissed. As the competitors got older, the pieces got more complex. A 15-year-old boy played Chopin with impressive technical skill. A 16-year-old girl performed Debussy with beautiful dynamics. The audience clapped politely after each performance, but Robert seemed unmoved by all of it. "These kids are good," Tommy whispered to his mother. "Like, really good." Linda nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was worried too, though she tried not to show it. What if Sophie wasn't ready for this level of competition? What if this whole thing backfired and made Robert's dismissiveness even worse? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, The announcer's voice came over the speakers. Our next performer is Sophie Carter, age 14. She'll be playing Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor by Rachmaninoff. Linda gasped softly. She's playing what? Tommy grinned. Just wait. Robert finally looked up from his phone, a slight frown on his face. He'd heard of Rachmaninoff. That was advanced stuff. Concert pianist stuff. What was Sophie thinking? She'd been playing for 6 months. This was going to be a disaster. Sophie walked onto the stage, and for a moment Linda barely recognized her daughter. Gone was the uncertain girl who practiced in their basement. Sophie walked with her shoulders back, her head high. She wore the navy dress like armor. The stage lights were bright and hot. Sophie could feel hundreds of eyes on her as she crossed to the grand piano at center stage. It was a beautiful instrument, much nicer than the old upright in their basement. She sat down on the bench and adjusted its height slightly, taking her time, just like Mrs. Chen had taught her. In the audience, Robert leaned forward slightly. He'd never actually watched Sophie play, he realized. Not really. He'd heard her from other rooms, had complained about the noise, but he'd never sat and observed her at the piano. Sophie positioned her hands over the keys and closed her eyes. For just a moment, she let herself remember everything, every dismissive comment, every time her father had made her feel worthless. Every moment she'd wanted to quit but hadn't. She thought about Mrs. Chen's faith in her, about Tommy's excitement, about her mother's quiet support, and then she began to play. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 crashed through the concert hall like a wave. Powerful, dramatic, impossible to ignore. The sound was so big, so commanding, that several people in the audience actually jumped slightly in their seats. Robert's phone slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor. He didn't notice. He was staring at the stage with his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide with shock. That was his daughter. His daughter was creating that sound. Sophie's fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed and precision. The complex runs that had taken her weeks to master flowed from her hands like water. But it wasn't just technical skill. There was something else in her playing, something raw and emotional that grabbed everyone in the room by the throat and refused to let go. She played with fury and grace, with pain and hope. Every note carried the weight of 3 months of secret practice, of a father's dismissal, of a teenager's desperate need to be seen and heard. The music swelled and crashed and whispered, and through it all, Sophie commanded the stage like she'd been born to be there. In the front row, Mrs. Chen had tears streaming down her face. She'd known Sophie was talented, but this was beyond even her expectations. This was something transcendent. Linda grabbed Robert's hand without thinking, squeezing it so hard her knuckles turned white. Tears were flowing freely down her cheeks. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Robert, that's our daughter." But Robert couldn't speak. He was frozen, completely transfixed by what he was seeing. His mind was reeling, trying to reconcile the girl on stage with the daughter he thought he knew. How had he missed this? How had he been so blind? Around them, other parents were whispering to each other, glancing at their programs to see who this remarkable young pianist was. The performance had transformed the entire atmosphere in the hall. This wasn't just another competition entry. This was something special, something that demanded attention. Sophie reached the emotional heart of the piece, the section that had made her cry during practice. Her hands moved across the keys with a gentleness that made the previous power even more striking. The melody was heartbreaking, beautiful, and in this moment Sophie wasn't in a concert hall anymore. She was somewhere else entirely, lost in the music, letting it pour out of her without fear or hesitation. And Robert, watching his daughter play with a skill and passion he'd never imagined she possessed, felt something crack open inside his chest. Sophie's fingers moved through the final section of the concerto with breathtaking intensity. The music built and built, climbing toward its powerful conclusion. Every person in that concert hall was completely still, afraid that even breathing too loudly might break the spell she'd cast. The technical difficulty of what she was playing was extraordinary. Rapid cascades of notes, complex chord progressions, dramatic dynamic shifts that required both physical strength and delicate control. Professional pianists spent years mastering this piece. Sophie had learned it in 3 months, and she was playing it like she'd been born knowing it. Robert's face had gone through several transformations during the performance. Shock, disbelief, something that looked almost like pain. Now, as the piece raced toward its conclusion, tears were sliding down his cheeks. He didn't bother wiping them away. He couldn't look away from the stage, couldn't process what he was witnessing. This was his daughter. The girl whose practicing he'd called noise. The girl whose dreams he'd dismissed as a phase. The girl he'd never truly listened to. And she was brilliant. Sophie struck the final powerful chord, her whole body leaning into it, putting everything she had left into that last moment. The sound echoed through the hall, rich and full and perfect. Then silence. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. The entire audience seemed frozen, caught between the world of the music and reality. Sophie kept her hands on the keys, her eyes still closed, her chest heaving from the effort. Then the applause started. It wasn't polite applause like the other performers had received. It was explosive. People jumped to their feet instantly, clapping so hard their hands had to hurt. Whistles and cheers erupted from different sections of the audience. It was the kind of response usually reserved for professional concerts, not a youth competition. Sophie opened her eyes, blinking in the bright stage lights. For a moment she looked startled, almost confused, as if she'd forgotten there was an audience at all. Then slowly a smile spread across her face. Not a big showy smile, just a small, genuine expression of relief and pride and joy. She stood and took a bow, her legs feeling shaky beneath her. The applause somehow got even louder. In the audience, Tommy was jumping up and down, shouting and clapping. Linda was sobbing openly, not even trying to hide it anymore. And Robert stood there with tears streaming down his face, clapping mechanically, his mind spinning. Sophie walked off stage, and the applause continued for several more seconds before finally dying down. The announcer had to wait an extra moment before speaking, clearing his throat twice. "Well," he said, and there was an amazed quality to his voice. "That was certainly something special. Let's have another round of applause for Sophie Carter." The audience erupted again. Backstage, Sophie's legs finally gave out. She sat down hard on a folding chair, her entire body shaking with adrenaline. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. After 3 months of secret practice of doubt and fear and determination, she'd walked onto that stage and played the performance of her life. Mrs. Chen found her a moment later, pulling her into a tight hug. The older woman was crying and laughing at the same time. "I knew you could do it," Mrs. Chen said, holding Sophie's face in her hands. "I knew it. That was perfect. That was better than perfect. That was magical." "I didn't mess up?" Sophie asked, still not quite believing it was over. "You didn't mess up anything. You were flawless." Mrs. Chen's eyes were shining. "Sophie, in 40 years of teaching, I have never heard a student play like that. Never." The rest of the competition continued, but it felt almost anticlimactic. The remaining performers were good, some of them very good, but none of them had the impact Sophie had. Parents in the audience kept whispering about her, checking their programs, wondering where she studied and how long she'd been playing. When the last performer finished, there was an intermission while the judge deliberated. Sophie rejoined her family in the audience, sliding into the seat next to Tommy. Her brother immediately grabbed her in a hug. "That was insane. You were amazing. Everyone's talking about you." Linda reached across and squeezed Sophie's hand, too emotional to speak. Her eyes were still red from crying, and then there was Robert. Sophie finally let herself look at her father. He was staring at her with an expression she'd never seen before. His eyes were red too, his face pale. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but no words came out. He closed it again, shaking his head slightly as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd witnessed. The silence between them was heavy with everything that hadn't been said for months. All the cruel comments, all the dismissals, all the times he'd made her feel worthless. It hung there in the space between them, impossible to ignore now. "Sophie," he finally managed, his voice rough. "I didn't know. I didn't..." But before he could finish, the lights dimmed again. The judges were ready to announce the results. The announcer returned to the stage with a sheet of paper in his hands. He talked about the high caliber of performers they'd seen today, about how difficult it had been for the judges to make their decisions. Sophie's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. In third place, performing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, we have Daniel Martinez. Applause. A teenage boy walked onto the stage to receive his trophy, beaming with pride. In second place, performing Debussy's Clair de Lune, We have Jennifer Wong. More applause. The girl who'd played earlier walked up looking thrilled despite not winning first place. Sophie held her breath. This was it. And in first place, the announcer said, and Sophie could swear he was smiling directly at their section of the audience performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. We have Sophie Carter. The audience exploded into applause again. Tommy was shouting. Linda was crying again. And Sophie just sat there for a second, stunned, before Tommy practically shoved her out of her seat. Go get your trophy. Sophie walked down the aisle toward the stage in a daze. First place. She'd won first place. Her legs carried her up the stairs and across the stage automatically. The announcer handed her a large trophy, bigger than she'd expected, and shook her hand enthusiastically. That was an extraordinary performance, he said, loud enough for the microphone to pick up. One of the best we've seen in the 15 years of this competition. Sophie held the trophy, feeling its weight in her hands. It was real. This was really happening. She'd proven everyone wrong. But more importantly, she'd proven something to herself. That she had a gift. That her father's words hadn't been the truth. That she was capable of something remarkable. She looked out into the audience, finding her family. Tommy was still jumping around. Linda was clapping so hard it looked painful. Mrs. Chen was standing off to the side, her hand pressed to her heart, crying happy tears. And Robert. Her father stood there with his hands hanging at his sides, no longer clapping. He was just staring at her with tears running down his face. His expression was complex, layers of emotion she couldn't quite name. Shock, pride, regret, pain. Their eyes met across the distance, and something passed between them. An understanding, maybe, or an acknowledgement that everything had changed in the last 12 minutes, that there was no going back to the way things had been. Sophie raised the trophy slightly, a small gesture just for him. Look at what you almost made me give up, that gesture said. Look at what you couldn't see. Robert's face crumpled. He pressed his hand to his mouth, his whole body shaking with emotion. Linda put her arm around him, but he barely seemed to notice. The announcer asked Sophie to play a short excerpt from her piece, as was tradition for the first place winner. She returned to the piano, set her trophy carefully to the side, and played the most emotional section of the concerto again. The beautiful, heartbreaking melody filled the hall once more, and this time, Sophie played it looking directly at her father. This is who I am, the music seemed to say. This is what you couldn't hear when you were yelling down the basement stairs. This is what you missed. When she finished, the applause washed over her again. But Sophie barely heard it. She was watching her father bury his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs. She'd won the competition. She'd proven she was talented. She'd shown everyone in that hall what she was capable of. But the real victory was the broken look on her father's face, the realization of how wrong he'd been, the understanding that he'd almost destroyed something precious with his thoughtless words. That trophy in her hands meant something, but the tears on Robert's face meant even more. Sophie picked up her trophy and walked off the stage. Backstage, she could hear people congratulating each other, parents praising their children, teachers discussing the various performances. But all Sophie could think about was what would happen next, when she had to face her father and all the words that had been left unsaid. Sophie stood backstage, clutching her trophy, as other performers and their families filtered out of the concert hall. She could hear the buzz of excited conversation, parents congratulating their children, teachers discussing plans for future competitions. But she stayed frozen in place, not ready to face what waited for her on the other side of that curtain. Mrs. Chen found her first, appearing beside her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. Your family is waiting for you in the lobby. Are you ready? Sophie nodded, even though she wasn't sure if that was true. They walked together through the backstage area and out into the main lobby. The space was crowded with people, but Sophie spotted her family immediately. They were standing near the tall windows, sunlight streaming in around them. Tommy saw her first and came running over. You won! You actually won! That was the coolest thing I've ever seen. Linda was right behind him, pulling Sophie into a tight hug. I'm so proud of you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. So incredibly proud. I had no idea you were working on something so difficult. Sweetheart, you were magnificent. Sophie hugged her mother back, feeling the trophy press awkwardly between them. Over her mother's shoulder she could see her father. Robert stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his eyes red. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last hour. Linda pulled back, wiping her eyes. I'll give you two a moment, she said quietly, taking Tommy's hand and leading him toward the refreshment table on the other side of the lobby. Sophie and her father stood facing each other. The noise of the crowd seemed to fade away. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sophie held her trophy against her chest like a shield, waiting. Robert opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. Sophie, His voice cracked. He took a breath and tried again. I don't even know where to start. You could start with an apology, Sophie said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. She'd imagined this moment for weeks, but now that it was here, she felt calmer than she'd expected. I'm sorry, Robert said immediately, the words tumbling out. God, Sophie, I'm so sorry. For everything. For every terrible thing I said, for every time I dismissed you, for every moment I made you feel like you weren't good enough. His voice broke completely. You're extraordinary. What you did up there, I've never seen anything like it, and I almost destroyed it. I almost destroyed you. Tears were streaming down his face now, and he didn't bother hiding them. Several people nearby glanced over, curious about the emotional scene playing out. Do you know what the worst part is? Robert continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I knew how my words felt. When I was your age, my father told me I'd never make it as a musician. He said I was wasting my time with my guitar, that I needed to focus on real career prospects. And it hurt so much that I gave up. I put away my guitar and never played again. Sophie stared at her father, seeing him differently for the first time. Not as the confident lawyer who always knew best, but as someone who'd had his own dreams crushed. And instead of learning from that pain, Robert went on, instead of making sure my children never felt that way, I did the exact same thing to you. I heard you practicing, and all I could think was that you were going to end up disappointed like I was. So I tried to make you quit before you could fail. But I was wrong. You weren't going to fail. You were going to soar, and I was too blind and too damaged to see it. He took a step closer, his hands reaching out but not quite touching her. Sophie, I have spent the last hour sitting in that theater listening to people talk about how talented you are, about how you're the most promising young pianist they've seen in years. And all I could think was that I almost killed that. With my words, with my dismissiveness, with my own failures. I almost took this gift away from you. Sophie felt her own eyes filling with tears now. She'd been so angry at her father for so long, had carried the hurt around like a weight, but looking at him now, broken and remorseful, she felt something shift inside her. You really hurt me, Dad, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. Every time you yelled down those basement stairs, every time you made a joke about my playing at dinner, every time you acted like I was just being a nuisance. It made me feel worthless. It made me want to quit. I know, Robert said, his voice breaking. I know, and I will regret it for the rest of my life. But I didn't quit, Sophie continued. Mrs. Chen showed me that I had something real. She believed in me when you wouldn't. She gave me a chance to prove myself, and I did. She held up the trophy, not as a weapon but as evidence. This is real, Dad. My talent is real, and I need you to understand that not just today when I won a competition and everyone's praising me, but tomorrow and next week and next year when I'm back in the basement practicing the same section over and over again. Robert nodded frantically. I understand. I swear to you I understand now. I will never dismiss you again. I will never make you feel small again. How can I trust that? Sophie asked, and it was the question she really needed answered. How do I know this isn't just guilt talking? That next month you won't go back to making jokes about my practicing? Robert was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking as he opened it and scrolled through something. Finally, he turned the screen towards Sophie. I just emailed my assistant, he said. I'm taking tomorrow off work. And I want you to take me to meet Mrs. Chen. I want to ask her how I can support you properly, what kind of piano you need, what kind of practice schedule if there are summer programs or competitions you should enter. I want to learn about your world instead of dismissing it. He put the phone away and looked directly into Sophie's eyes. And I want to soundproof the basement properly. Not so I don't have to hear you, but so you have a real space to practice without worrying about bothering anyone. A space that shows you I take this seriously, that I take you seriously. Sophie felt something loosen in her chest. It wasn't complete forgiveness, not yet. Trust would take time to rebuild. But it was a start. A real one, okay, she said softly. Okay. Robert let out a shaky breath of relief. Can I hug you, please? Sophie hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. Robert pulled her into his arms, careful not to crush the trophy between them, and held her like she was the most precious thing in the world. His whole body was shaking with sobs. I'm so proud of you, he whispered into her hair. So incredibly proud. And I'm so sorry I didn't see it before. They stood like that for a long minute, father and daughter, beginning the slow work of healing what had been broken. When they finally pulled apart, Linda and Tommy had returned, both of them crying too now. Family hug, Tommy declared, and suddenly all four of them were wrapped together, laughing and crying at the same time. The months that followed were transformative. Robert kept every promise he'd made. He took the next day off work and met with Mrs. Chen for over an hour, asking questions and taking notes like he was preparing for a major case. He hired contractors to soundproof the basement and bought Sophie a beautiful upright piano that Mrs. Chen helped him select. But more than the material things, Robert changed himself. He started coming down to the basement to listen when Sophie practiced, sitting quietly on the stairs, never interrupting. At first, Sophie found it awkward, but gradually it became comforting. Sometimes when she'd finish a piece, he'd applaud softly. He never offered criticism, never tried to coach her. He just listened. He attended every recital after that, always sitting in the front row. He learned the names of composers and pieces. He asked Sophie about her lessons, really listening to her answers instead of just nodding absently. Word of Sophie's performance at the competition spread. She received invitations to play at other venues. And eventually, she was accepted into a prestigious summer music program at a conservatory 3 states away. Robert drove her there himself, helped her move into the dorms, and cried when he had to leave her there. 2 years later, when Sophie received an early admission letter from one of the top music conservatories in the country, with a full scholarship, Robert framed it and hung it in his office at work. When colleagues asked about it, he'd tell them about his daughter, the pianist, his voice full of pride and more than a little regret. On the day Sophie left for conservatory, Robert helped her pack the car. As they were loading the last box, he pulled out something wrapped in cloth. When Sophie unwrapped it, she found his old guitar, the one he'd put away decades ago after his father's harsh words. I want you to have this, Robert said. Not to play unless you want to, but as a reminder that dreams are fragile things and the people we love need to be their protectors, not their destroyers. Sophie hugged her father tightly. Thank you, Dad, for everything. For changing. Thank you for not giving up, Robert replied. For being stronger than I ever was. For showing me what I almost lost. Years later, on the night of Sophie's debut performance at a major concert hall, Robert sat in the audience with Linda and Tommy, now a teenager himself, as Sophie walked onto that stage in an elegant gown. As she sat at the grand piano and began to play, Robert reached into his wallet and pulled out a photograph. It was from that first competition. Sophie at 14, holding her trophy with a determined smile. He'd kept it with him every day since then, a reminder of his greatest failure and his greatest lesson. Sophie's music filled the concert hall, powerful and perfect and full of all the emotion that had driven her from the beginning, and Robert, listening with tears in his eyes, understood finally what it meant to truly hear someone, not just their music, but their heart, their dreams, their soul. He'd almost missed it, almost destroyed something irreplaceable because of his own pain and blindness. But Sophie had been strong enough, talented enough, determined enough to break through his walls and show him the truth. And for that, he would be grateful for the rest of his life.